Welcome to the Sex Science Podcast, where we turn the latest peer-reviewed research on intimacy and sexuality into fun, accessible conversations. Generated by AI and fact-checked by experts, the Sex Science Podcast was created by LaShaw to empower you through knowledge. So, join us as we explore pleasure, relationships, human connection, and everything in between.
Welcome to our deep dive. We'll be exploring what leads to a satisfying sex life for women between 18 and 50.
Sounds intriguing.
Our main source is a 2024 study from Frontiers in Psychology. They surveyed over 1,000 Spanish women, and they looked at behaviors, attitudes, what leads to feeling good about your sex life.
I like that approach. It's refreshing. So often research just hones in on difficulties or dysfunction, but this is looking at what's working well.
Yeah, and that leads right into a fascinating finding. The women in the study, they reported high levels of sexual satisfaction. Overall.
Interesting.
Not just okay, but really feeling good about things.
Huh. See, this challenges some assumptions, right? We tend to hear so much about the negatives, especially as women age or go through life changes. But this data suggests, well, there's a lot of positivity here too.
Right. So what factors did the study link to this high satisfaction? They dug into this idea of sexual self-efficacy, didn't they?
Exactly. Sexual self-efficacy, or SSE. It's about feeling confident, capable in navigating sexual situations.
I see.
It's more than just knowing the facts. It's about feeling empowered to actually take action. And the study found a strong connection between SSE and sexual satisfaction.
Makes sense intuitively.
Right. But the interesting part is why. It wasn't just about confident women feeling better. They also tended to be more sexually active and in more varied ways. And then all that variety, it seems to boost their overall satisfaction even more.
Wow. So it's like a positive feedback loop.
It really is.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. The study also found that how much importance a woman placed on having a satisfying sex life, like how much she valued it, that actually played a huge role. Women who said it was really important to them were even more satisfied overall.
It suggests this chain reaction. Feeling confident leads to being more sexually active, which then reinforces how important sex is in your life, leading to greater overall satisfaction. And, the researchers point out that this idea of women valuing a fulfilling sex life, that's getting more and more recognized these days.
Interesting.
It wasn't always the case.
That is fascinating.
Yeah.
What kind of questions did they ask to get all this information?
Well, for sexual self-efficacy, they focused on two main areas: preventative actions and what they called health-promoting actions. For example, their questionnaire, it included items like feeling comfortable discussing STD prevention with a partner, or bringing up new things you'd like to try.
Okay, so it's not just about feeling confident and avoiding bad stuff, but also feeling empowered to go after positive sexual experience.
Exactly. And then when it came to measuring their sexual behavior, they asked about a bunch of different things, both with partners and solo. They wanted to know how often people were doing things like kissing and intercourse, but also things like masturbation and having fantasies.
Wow, they really covered a lot.
They did. And they also asked about who usually initiates sex.
Oh, interesting.
And how often couples talk about their needs and desires.
So it was a pretty in-depth look at all these different aspects of sexual behavior.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, and how about the importance piece? How much importance women placed on having a fulfilling sex life? How'd they measure that?
Actually, they just used one question for that.
Really?
Yeah, they asked participants to rate how important it is for them to have an active, healthy, and satisfying sex life. And it was on a scale from not important at all to very important.
Interesting. And then how do they actually measure satisfaction itself?
They used something called the Sexual Satisfaction Comprehensive Index.
What?
Yeah, it's a mouthful. But basically it includes 4 questions that look at a woman's actual satisfaction and also her desired level of satisfaction. So taking into account both partnered and individual sexual activities.
So it's not just about how content you are now, but also how that stacks up against what you'd ideally want.
Exactly. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that the study was done in Spain.
Right.
So, it would be really interesting to see if similar research in other cultures, maybe find some differences because of different social norms and attitudes.
That's a great point. Culture can have a huge impact on how people view and experience all this stuff.
For sure.
Societies have such different views on sex and relationships.
It gets really nuanced here because we're acknowledging that individual experiences, they're shaped by larger forces. What's normal, what's acceptable, it varies so much around the world.
Wow.
And that influences how women see themselves their sexuality.
For example, just think about how cultures differ on things like, premarital sex, even public displays of affection.
Right. Those social norms, they can really impact someone's comfort level with exploring their own desires, their needs.
Definitely. And these cultural scripts, whether they're explicitly stated or just kind of subtly conveyed, they can have a powerful effect on a woman's sexual self-efficacy, I'd imagine.
Absolutely. In cultures where women are traditionally expected to be passive or submissive, well, it's easy to see how they might struggle to assert themselves sexually, even if they want to.
Makes sense. If you're constantly receiving messages that discourage you from embracing your sexuality, it's going to be harder to feel confident and capable.
It's almost like this internal conflict between your own desires and what society expects of you. That's why it's so important to recognize how these cultural contexts, they can influence those internal scripts and ultimately women's sexual experiences.
So building on what the study found, could we hypothesize that cultures that are more open, more accepting of female sexuality, that they might actually foster higher levels of sexual self-efficacy in women?
It's a reasonable assumption. It's interesting to think about this in light of the fact that the study focused on Spanish women.
Right.
Spain has gone through some significant cultural shifts in recent decades, becoming more liberal in a lot of ways, including views on sexuality.
So even within one country, there can be a lot of variation and evolution in those cultural norms.
Absolutely. We got to be careful about making broad generalizations.
Of course. So while these findings are super insightful, we can't just assume they apply to everyone everywhere.
Yeah, definitely not. But I still think the idea that confidence plays such a big role, it's really compelling.
For sure.
And don't forget about how much importance women placed on having a fulfilling sex life. You know, it really shows that it's not just about doing certain things. It's about how you see and value your own sexual well-being.
And that feels like something people can actually work on, right?
Yeah.
Like you can decide that having a fulfilling sex life is important to you, and then you can start making choices that line up with that.
Exactly. That's one of the big takeaways here. You know, prioritizing your sexual well-being. It's just like prioritizing your physical health or your mental health.
Totally. But I think it's also important to acknowledge that we all have these kind of personal microcultures that influence our views on sexuality.
Interesting.
Our family values, religious beliefs, even our own personal experiences. And that's something for all of us to reflect on, right? How have those personal influences shaped our own understanding of sexuality? And how can we maybe challenge or embrace those influences to create a more fulfilling, a more authentic experience for ourselves?
That's a powerful question.
So let's go back to sexual self-efficacy. How can women build that confidence, that capability in their sexual lives?
I think it comes back to knowledge is power. The more you understand about your body, your desires, the whole spectrum of sexuality, the more empowered you'll feel to make choices that are right for you.
And there are so many resources out there now, books, websites, even podcasts like this one.
It's about being proactive, seeking out good information.
But it's not just about absorbing info, right? It's about applying it.
Absolutely. Experimenting, figuring out what works for you personally.
And that might mean stepping outside your comfort zone, trying new things.
Being open to learning and growing. It's a journey of self-discovery. And it can be incredibly rewarding.
I bet. And I imagine communication with your partner plays a huge role here too.
Huge. Creating that safe space to share your needs, desires, even fears, that makes all the difference.
It's about building trust, intimacy, that sense of shared exploration.
Exactly.
We've covered a lot today, but it all comes back to this. There's no right or wrong way to experience sexuality.
It's about honoring the diversity of experiences, embracing individuality, and empowering women to define their own paths to sexual well-being. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for listening to the Sex Science Podcast brought to you by LaShaw. We hope that you learned something new about the wonderful world of human intimacy and sexuality, and join us next time as we dive into more fascinating research. And remember, science is for you. Music for this podcast was produced by SOUNDRAW.